Good morning, everyone. Welcome for our second episode of those medical device podcasts. Today, we're talking about navigating the custom brokerage, and we have a special guest, Shannon, from the owner of AC Custom Brokerage. Shannon, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me. Good morning, everybody.
So, Shannon, before we start, can you talk about a little bit, of you and your company, where you're coming from, how long you've been in business?
Absolutely. So I started in the customs brokerage realm in 2010. I actually have a master's degree in social work and somehow swayed off of that, but started working for DHL Global Forwarding, not to be confused with DHL Express. They are separate. I worked there for about 3 years and they consolidated their product, and we'll talk a little bit about that later. So they consolidated their brokerage product and I left for a smaller brokerage firm. I am here in Denver, Colorado, and I worked for that small firm for another about 7 years. And then as things shifted in the customs world and customer service became a little bit more hard to come by, I branched off. I got licensed in 2017 and then branched off and opened my own company, a custom brokerage, in 2020. So I've been in the business, it'll be about 14 years.
And we've been working with you since a couple of years, and one of the reasons that we're sticking with you and your team is because the incredible service that you give to your customers. So I want to acknowledge the great service we're getting from your team.
Thank you.
So the first question, obviously, since we're talking about custom brokerage, is what's the role of a custom broker exactly?
Yes, this is often a question I get because it gets a little cloudy at times. Many people think that the broker's role is to actually do the work for the importer. That is not the case, but we are a huge pivotal liaison between importers that purchase internationally and the various agencies. So not just U.S. Customs and Border Protection, but PGAs, which stand for Partner Government Agencies, FDA, obviously with your medical devices, and there's about 57 others, anywhere from EPA, CPSC, NHTSA, we could go on and on. So we are sort of the interim between the importer and these government agencies. Our job is to kind of assist importers and guide them on some of these regulations, and to facilitate the entry filing of the paperwork required with these various agencies. So we do provide guidance. We are not there to legally confirm. That gets a
That's
little
important,
blurry.
yeah.
That's very important. I can guide you and I can provide you information, but I am not the master of knowledge on your product, right? So it's kind of a partnership. Like, I know customs, you know your product, let's work together and try to figure out what you need to get this admissible into the country, right? And that's the biggest part. So we're going to file the entry and get the duties and taxes confirmed for you. We oftentimes are outlaying the duties to customs on their behalf, but that has become a standard practice and not an obligation. So that is also a separate kind of thing. So we're going to work with these agencies on your behalf and get the paperwork filed so that you can get your product.
Okay. Who could be a custom broker? Can I decide to be a custom broker tomorrow?
Not tomorrow, no. So you must be a U.S. citizen.
Okay.
You must be 21 years of age. The regulations state you must be good moral character. They do not get very specific on what you can and can't have in terms of previous issues with the law, but I will tell you that they really dive into monetary issues. So bankruptcies, money laundering, anything like that. A conviction that maybe is not like misdemeanor and not money related, they look at it and they will interview you about it, but they just state good moral character. So I think that can go either way. And you do have to take an exam, and you have to pass with 75%. The typical passing rate for this exam is less than 13% each time.
Oh, wow. Okay.
It's a very difficult test, and it's very it gets very legal, and very specific. So that part is difficult. Once you have those things, you apply and you are interviewed, and then you have to be approved. So it's quite the
Okay.
process.
Interesting. And I guess when you look on the market, there's a lot of external custom broker, but people sometimes confuse with, I'm not going to name a shipping company, but they have their own internal, custom brokerage. How does that work? What's the difference between the two?
Yes. So a lot of times, and I'll name some companies just because people know the names, right? So larger brokers such as DHL Global Forwarding, DHL Express, FedEx, UPS, these companies are often one in the same. They have a customs brokerage department, and then their primary reason for business is the freight forwarding side of things, right? These companies, although when they streamline this service to you, they're selling the customs brokerage piece as a value-added service. So they're saying to people, we're going to move your freight, we're going to ship it to your door, and we will handle everything, including custom brokerage. That sounds fantastic, right? To anybody that
Yeah.
doesn't know too much about the process. What happens is that these companies are very large. You can be talking to a different person every single time. And it's not the bread and butter of their business, right? They make the money in freight, and customs brokerage is kind of this side piece. So when it works, it seems great, shows up to your door, fantastic. But I won't put a number on it. A lot of times your freight gets stuck, somebody's trying to reach out to you for information that is needed, and that is a valid thing. They need the information, but there's a lot of time lost in lost communication, right? So external brokers such as myself tend to focus strictly on customs brokerage. I'm a lot more willing to speak to people about questions and walking them through the process, and you're more likely to have somebody that has a direct contact to somebody that's actually handling the customs piece versus a department of data entry people that are simply just inputting information.
I have to say, we've been doing this since 10 years, and we saw a huge difference in terms of how quickly an external custom broker, like you can speed up the process to get a shipment released by custom or by the FDA, because we're talking about medical devices. And time is money for a lot of those manufacturing companies. Sometimes they need something in the US very quickly because an hospital needs it, a physician needs it. So I think we saw the value on working with external custom broker. And also, like you said, those big shipping company, and we have that experience. If you try to reach out to somebody there, it's a nightmare. You're gonna go in a circle talking to customer services, talking to this person and that person, and trying to get to the right person is very, very difficult. It's time consuming, and it's frustrating most of the time. And I'm not talking bad about those people working there. However, for them, it's a 9 to 4 job.
Yes.
They click in, click out. They don't really
Yes.
care about your shipment.
No, yeah,
You're
and
just a
you have to
number.
think, exactly to your point, Stephan, you have to think about their business model. It's very different, and brokers are a dime a dozen, okay? There's thousands of us. There's thousands of freight forwarders. And it's not to say one company is better than the other. It depends on what your business is looking for and what you need, right? It also depends on what you're shipping. So a large company like that, their business model, just like you said, and they're also, as a side note, they're handling almost over a billion e-commerce shipments a year. Okay, so you have hundreds of people sitting at a desk that are simply going through a pile of entries, and if they get to your entry and they see they're missing information, they shoot out an email and they put it on the bottom, and then they work through their load. It's a very different business model than somebody like an external broker that is going to follow up more and have a more personal touch than somebody that's going through a stack of entries.
Yeah, and my impression also is that external custom broker, because it's kind of their passion, because they're their company, their job. I have the impression they know more. and they're more specific. They're look, you know, they. I don't know. I have the impression that they're more by the book also sometimes. So I think it makes a huge difference. My
Absolutely.
next question, and this one is coming from a customer, an external customer, and I just want you, that person, she sent, you know, a video. So I just want to show you our question, and if you can answer after that. So let me do this. I'm going to share my screen here, and here we go. Okay. Hey Shannon, this is Francesca. I was wondering, do you know if all custom broker can clear medical devices?
So the question is, can customs brokers clear medical devices, all of them? Can they? Yes, they have the ability. You don't need any additional training to do so.
Okay.
However, I would be cautious if you're hiring a customs broker to ensure that they have filed medical devices before,
Okay.
because not every broker, and I'll speak for myself. So we handle a lot of medical devices. I have in the past. I have to this day. I will not, there are certain agencies or certain commodities that I will not handle. And it's just because importing is so vast. And even as a customs broker, there's going to be things that I have not cleared or don't know. Does it mean I can't learn it? Sure. But when I've got these other areas of expertise, we tend to kind of break off and just start handling, you know, what we are used to and what we know best. So can they clear FDA devices? Yes. I would be cautious about just hiring anybody to do so.
Yeah.
Not everybody has the expertise or the knowledge about what is needed.
Because when we were looking for different custom brokerage company, some on their website, they do specific that they are specialized in this and that and that. Mm-hmm. So that was my impression, that some are not regularly, you know, clearing medical devices, and there's so many regulation with the FDA, and we're going to talk about this in another podcast. But it's heavily regulated. So if you deal with a custom broker that's not very familiar with that, they can miss stuff, and
Yeah.
you know, who
That's
knows
a
what
side
that's.
note, Stephan. I want to make it clear to people too that are probably not going to understand this, that no matter, this is a kind of a scary thought, no matter what a broker files on your behalf, the importer is liable for that information.
Yeah.
So now, and of course, if a broker is being negligent, and there's, you know, there's going to be some recourse on that. But if you tell me, I think this is what it is, and I go, okay, and I file it, and that's incorrect, I'm only as good as the information you're giving me. So you
Yeah.
have to make sure, because a lot of people mistake, oh, well, the broker knows this stuff, they need to file it correctly. But we don't have some of this information. A lot of the information has to come from the importer. So if you don't know how to file an FDA entry, yeah, you're filing incorrectly and getting holds or whatever the case may be. So I would just ensure that whoever you hire, I would ask some questions about what experience they have with medical devices specifically.
Yeah, and we do have some time experience where, not because of the custom broker, but the information is given to the custom broker by the manufacturing company is, I won't say wrong, but incomplete or inaccurate. And the FDA could just say, wait a minute, you know, this is misbranding, for example. And that could be a huge issue at the end of the
Yes.
day.
Yes.
Does the regulation for custom in the US is the same as other countries? Is there any difference? How do, you know, if people is in Germany, is it the same thing in Germany that it's in the US regarding customs?
They are all different. So every single country has their own regulations regarding customs, regarding duty, regarding some countries have VAT, for example, value added tax. Most people in Europe are familiar with that. The US does not have that. People confuse taxes and duties. Every customs broker has to be licensed within the country that they are working. So in the US, I can't clear customs entries for somebody in Switzerland. I'm not a licensed Swiss broker, right? So every country has different laws, regulations surrounding duties and imports. Some of those differences also are about de minimis, which is what cap can you bring in goods without
Okay.
paying duty. Every country is different about that. And everything is constantly evolving, right? So you can see here in the US, for example, what stands now is likely to change with an election year coming up, right? So there's a lot of talk about what's going to change. So they are all very different, and you need a broker within that country that you intend to import.
So that brings me to a sub question to this. You're talking about tax and duty. What's the difference between the two?
So again, every country is different, but here in the US, people often confuse stateside sales, which has to do with your state sales tax. That is nothing to do with international duty, okay? When you import goods, you are paying duties to the US government as a federal entity. Beyond that, your internal sales within the United States, you're dealing with sales tax and state regulations. So they are different, and we often get people confused. They'll call with questions about, in this state, sales tax, and I know nothing about that, right?
And it's
So
confusing.
it is very confusing, and you have to think of it as a separate transaction totally. You're going to pay duties and taxes on what you purchase goods for internationally. That shouldn't be the same invoice that you are providing to your customers here in the US, because you're a business and you want to make money. So those are very separate transactions. Duties and taxes are completely two different entities, essentially.
So on medical device, for most country, there's no taxes on medical device. So when, at the border to the US government. But I think what's confusing is with China, for example. People will ask me, and sometimes I don't know what it is today, So is there taxes on Chinese medical device right now or not?
So it's not taxes, it's also additional duty.
Okay.
Most medical devices across the board, most are duty free. China even, there's a lot that are still duty free. Again, what I say today is likely to change. There's a lot of talk. But there is an additional, most items made in China, it is dependent on the country of manufacture and not where it's exported. If it's made in China and ships from Italy, you're going to be subject to additional China-made duty. Most of it is 25% additional.
Okay.
There are some commodities that are still only 7.5%, even fewer that are 0%. There's quite a bit of medical devices, even from China, that are still duty-free. But there's a lot of talk right now. The Biden administration pushed new duties on new articles that were supposed to start August 1st. That got pushed back. If Trump gets elected, there's a talk of an additional 60%. There's also been some conversation about just a standard 10% duty across the board. So right now, you're looking at 7.5% additional China-made or 25% additional China-made, and that is regardless of where you export from.
Okay. So if I'm shipping from Germany, medical devices, there's no tax on it, but there's still some duty, like there was merchandise processing fee, that's 0.
So in the U.S., you have standard duty, whatever percentage of the value paid on the product. That can range anywhere from 0% to 200, thousands if you get into certain commodities. Typically 0 to like 25% covers a lot of it. Then you have merchandise processing fee. This is a fee, also a duty paid to the U.S. government on air freight and ocean freight over $2,500. There are some exceptions, but you pay merchandise processing. It is 0.3464% of the value paid, so it's not a lot. It does max out, and there is a minimum. On the ocean freight side of things, you also have a harbor maintenance fee that's only for sea freight over $2,500, and it's 0.125% of the value paid. That does not max out, but that's a smaller percentage.
Okay.
So you may have a duty-free item and still have these merchandise processing and harbor maintenance that are much minimal. So you might see a duty charge, but your standard duty is actually 0.
And if I'm not mistaken, when the FDA also look at the invoice and the shipment, they charge like $20, $25, I think, just to review the documentation, if I'm not
That's
mistaken.
brokerage. That's our fees. So brokers charge it. So when you're filing, you're essentially filing two entries. You're filing one with Customs and one with FDA. It's within the same system, but it's a separate part of the entry where you're adding. So brokers charge differently for
Okay.
filing additional PGA entries in addition to the customs entry.
Okay. You were talking about 2,500. It seems to be that threshold where higher or under that, sometimes if under $2,500, it kind of go under the radar for some reason. So how does that work exactly?
That's a loaded question, Stephan. So the standard rule is if you import anything under $2,500, it doesn't need a formal entry by a customs broker, okay? And it doesn't have to be a customs broker, just so people know. You can file on behalf of yourself. You do have to have the software. Most people don't want to deal with that, right? But you need a formal entry. And the reason for that is because duties are due, okay? So when you ship smaller package, smaller value items, let's say $1,700 worth of goods, and it just shows up your door, people go, well, we had no problem clearing it last time, and now you've got a shipment that's $30,000. The difference is the duty, okay? So the standard rule, and I get weary about even saying this now because there is a lot of talk in the last 2 months about changing this threshold, okay? But right now, you could ship a package every single day under $2,500. It shows up to your door, no problem, okay? There's a lot of talk about shifting that for goods that need FDA, because you're hypothetically still supposed to file FDA, okay? So there's kind of this gray area where things are still going through, but I would expect that to change. And also, as you start moving through this China-US relationship, you can also, as an individual, ship under $800 free of duty with absolutely no even manifest entry, okay? And they're talking about changing that to $1 for China-made goods.
Okay, so impossible.
So, for those people that know these companies like Temu and Shine and all of these huge Chinese companies, there have been ocean vessels sitting on the coast with all of these packages because of the fentanyl crisis. So what they're doing is this whole e-commerce boom under $2,500 and really specifically under $800. They're starting to target. So they actually suspended a lot of brokers from clearing these entries under $800 because they want more information on it, where it used to just show up at your door and they didn't have information. So I would expect to see a lot of changes on that in the next year or two.
That's very interesting. And I guess that's probably the reason sometimes we have a customer says, I don't understand, I've been shipping for 3 years without any issue. And suddenly, it's like, well, things are moving, things are changing all the time.
And this is a moving target, and especially right now, it is really forefront. So ourselves, we used to file entries under $800. They're called Section 321s or 86s. We had a meeting with Denver Customs a couple weeks ago, and they were like, if I were a broker, I would not. So we've stopped filing them like that, which is unfortunate because then you have somebody, if they use us, that used to maybe not pay duty, and now you're paying the minimal, which is like 30 bucks. But it's just not worth the target on your back right now. So something to think about. But those customers are absolutely right. They probably have shipped for 3 years. It could change totally. They still could have something show up their door, no problem. But they can't expect it to always be the same because it is really a moving target right now.
What about the commercial value on a commercial invoice? And so I see people trying to play with that sometime. What you thinking about this? How customers should see
it's risky business if you're going to mess with it. I will say that.
Yeah.
People say we didn't get caught. Well, I don't know if I would approach it that way, because if you do, what it is duty evasion, right? So, which is a federal crime in the U.S. So, what they're looking for is a fair market price, okay? So, whatever you actually paid for the goods is what they want to see. If you have a situation where you're not paying for the goods and somebody's shipping you something to try out or research or whatever, they want a fair market value. So, if that company was going to sell that product to you, what would it be? Have they sold that product to other people? What was that cost? So if they're selling it to other people for $50,000 and all of a sudden they're telling you, oh, well, you can have this for $5,000. If that agreement was made and that's actually what you paid was 5,000, okay, that's fine. But if there's not any amount paid, you need to come up with a fair market value, because if customs audits you, and it happens all the time and people think it won't happen to me, but if they audit you, they are going to ask you for the financial proof of what you paid that customer or that vendor, and they're going to match that with your entry. So you have to have proof of what you paid.
Because in the medical device world, it happens all the time where a company just starting to sell in the US and they want to ship to a distributor, for example, or even to us, warehousing their product samples, They're not going to sell them. They just want, the distributor, the physician to look at the product.
Yes.
Most of the time, they will be non-sterile product for non-human use, for example. Is it still required to put, the real commercial value?
They should. I mean, there are, so on the US side, there's samples, but it's like under $2. It's very, very minimal. This is what I would say. Your risk, if you're bringing in a $50,000 machine, okay, and you're saying, I'm going to send this to them to try out and see how it works or to demo it, if your duty is 0, you really shouldn't be fighting about the minimal, merchandise processing fee for your risk of audit. So,
Yeah.
or even if it's $10,000, right? It's just not worth the risk. But again, if you guys have an agreement, you're like, okay, I'm going to sell it to you for $5,000 so that you can demo it and you can try it. If you actually paid $5,000, then that's the transaction that you actually created and you have proof of that. So
Yeah.
it only gets a little sticky when there's actual no monetary transaction in the, in that negotiation, where you really need to think about fair market value, what it would be sold for. What do they sell it for in Europe? It needs
Yeah.
to be something comparable.
What about product that are shipped here, a device, and but it's temporary? It would be shipped back to France, for example, to the manufacturing company. How does that work with the custom brokerage?
So there are certain shipments that can be brought to the U.S. temporarily, and this is kind of confusing because people think, well, I'm only importing it temporarily, it's coming back. Everything across the board should be temporary, and it just doesn't work that way. There are only 14 subcategories of an actual, what customs would call in the U.S. a temporary import bond, okay? There are some things for testing, there's some things, but the one we run into the most, demo products for like trade shows. There
Yeah.
is not a subheading for that. So if you think, I will say this, my recommendation, you need to read through those subheadings, explain why you're importing it. If it meets one of those temporary import bond scenarios, great, do it. But again, if your duty, the whole point of a temporary import bond is to not pay duty.
Yeah.
If you're importing something and your duty on a standard entry is going to be $40, it's not worth the temporary import bond to waive that $40, because you're going to have to pay a broker to open the temporary import bond entry, and you have to pay a broker to close it out when it exports. Okay, so you
Okay.
have to think about the cost of both and the liability. The other suggestion I would have, if you are importing devices that are not functional, not going to be used on humans, and you just want to simply show them for sales at a trade show, a carnet is the best way to go.
Okay.
Okay?
You're talking about some accessories.
Accessories, yes.
There's some misunderstanding. How does that work exactly? Because some company will ship a product and 2 months after they ship a part of it. It's an accessory. How does that work for the custom brokerage?
So it's very interesting because even I think it's very confusing on the FDA side of things. FDA specifically has a definition for FDA accessories, and it's very tricky even to us, but they state that if it is something that is meant to support, supplement, augment the performance of one of your devices, it should be listed with FDA, and it has to be filed with FDA. So that confuses people sometimes, because just simply supporting like a cable to a medical device, I wouldn't call that an accessory, right? Bring in the cable, you don't need the FDA. However, if you're augmenting a actual medical device with something that makes it functional, that is part of clearing FDA, and it needs to be listed and it needs to be filed. So I always tell people, if you're importing accessories, we have a couple customers now, I highly recommend splitting invoices. So these accessories are not considered FDA accessories, cables, plugs, things that are not actually augmenting if you're plugging it in.
Yeah.
Separate those from your actual FDA accessories so that you can separate and make it a little bit more, it's a lot easier to provide to FDA than when you have them all mixed together.
Yeah, I understand. And it's happening more and more, and especially,
Yes.
if it's they have a 510K for a specific product, there's multiple components in that product, and one product broke, and they need to ship, that part. I guess my understanding is when they ship it, they have to still go through it if it's the entire product itself, with the product code and the registration number and everything.
Correct. So what people really need to think about is the intended use codes for FDA, because there are intended use codes for essentially like a component that's meant to be part of a kit or whatever. It's not always worth it to file that way. You're still filing FDA with a medical device listing. So, I mean, it's really the same process. But I would highly recommend that when these companies are listing their products for FDA to get the medical device listing, ensure that all the components and all the accessories and all the parts that they use for that product are included in that application for that medical device listing.
Okay. So that brings me to my next question. What are the most common mistakes made by the shipper or the importer of medical devices? What do you see that happening a lot?
I mean, I would say the first thing, which it sounds very cliche, but quite honestly, just shipping a product and having no idea or no conversation with anybody about what it's going to take to clear that product, okay?
Yeah.
That happens more than you think. I'm sure you see it. Shows up and go, okay, well, do you have the medical device listing and you have this and that? And they're like, what? They haven't even started that process, right? So as you know, Stephan, there's quite a bit of legwork prior to even speaking to a broker about importing that you need to take care of in terms of applying for a 510K if it requires it. The other confusion that people get and make a mistake, they think that because a 510K is not required, it means that a medical device listing is not required, and that is not the case. Some products require pre-market approval and some products do not, but that does not mean that they don't need to be listed with FDA, okay?
Yeah.
So that's a huge mistake people think. They assume the 510K non-pre-market not needed means that they can just ship their product, and that is not the case.
Yeah.
The other common theme we see, and this changed just in 2016, so I mean relatively recent in the brokerage world, the shipper has to be registered as well. That was not the case prior to 2016. So a lot of times people, okay, they've got their pre-market, they've got their medical device, they have the manufacturer registered with FDA, they're shipping it out of a totally different country or a totally different warehouse, and that company that's listed on the airway bill in the other country is not registered. I have no way to clear that product because they have to be registered. And what FDA looks for that is because you could simply manufacture products, send it to another country. Who's to say that those products were not changed, manipulated, something to the effect that might cause a safety concern in the US? So that's the other mistake I see the biggest amount of time is that shippers or exporters that are actually moving the product, they're not the manufacturer. They think they don't need to be registered, and they do.
Yeah, we see that a lot. It's all about traceability for the FDA to make sure that everybody who's involved with that product, touch that product, is registered with the FDA. And I think that's different between the US and other country, probably. Yes. Other mistake that we see a lot of time, and we're going to touch about this in another podcast, but is the initial importer. So the difference between initial importer and importer of record. Can you talk about the importer of record first?
Yes, so importer of record is a customs term. The importer of record is essentially the owner or purchaser of the goods, okay? So you have to have some kind of financial interest in the product that's being imported. So I couldn't buy something from, overseas in China and then Stephan, you say, you know what, I'll be the importer record on that. Could you? Sure. Would it be legal? No. They're looking for the person that has the financial interest. So did you buy the goods? Are you involved in the transaction? The DII, or the device initial importer, is an FDA term. And yes, you get that right all the time. Even you see brokers mess that up sometimes.
Yeah.
They assume the initial importer is the importer of record, but the FDA device initial importer, and you can explain that more, is an FDA term only.
Yeah. And because again, for the FDA, I was talking about the foreign exporter. We're talking a company who's shipping from another location. They need to be registered as a foreign exporter, and it's about traceability. Well, the initial importer is the same thing. For a domestic distributor in the US, they don't have to register with the FDA if they buy product in the US and they sell it in the US. But as soon as they buy product or import product from outside the US, they need to be registered with the FDA because the FDA wants that traceability to be there.
Yes.
And yes, a lot of custom brokers, especially of the big company, the big shipping company, they confuse the term all the time. Actually, I think they don't know the difference.
Yeah, sometimes I wonder that too.
I wish we can do podcasts just for them, to educate them, what's the difference between initial importer and importer of record. But so if I'm based in Australia, for example, I'm the manufacturing company, can I be the importer of record?
You can be the importer of record. Some countries do not allow non-resident importers. The US does. So the only time, though, people need to be very careful. The only time that the shipper outside of the US can be the importer of record would be if the freight terms, the Incoterms, were DDP. DDP means delivered, duty paid. That means that the responsibility and the liability of this entire shipment to door is the responsibility of the shipper, including US customs duty and taxes and brokerage formalities. One caveat to this, and we have this conversation I know quite a bit, this was always the case, but it really started being enforced in 2019, so actually much more relatively recent than previous things we've discussed. If you are a non-resident importer, Australia, Germany, China, it does not matter, you must have an ultimate consignee, which is also different than the importer of record. You must have a U.S. ultimate consignee who's receiving the goods that is also on file with U.S. Customs. And what it comes down to is traceability, like you said, Stephan. So the U.S. government, even if this ultimate consignee in the U.S., which I'll make a side note, they are not the liable party. People get that confused. The importer of record is liable. The ultimate consignee in the U.S. has to be listed with Customs because they want to know, even though they're not the liable party, does this consignee have financial issues with the U.S. government? Does this consignee, it's the traceability thing. So maybe the shipper is fine, but maybe this consignee in the U.S. used to import. They used to be the importer of record. Maybe they defaulted on duties and taxes. Yeah. Maybe they're on some no-fly list. They want to see that all the parties in the transaction are okay. So this becomes a problem because when people ship as non-resident importers, they say, we want to ship to, let's say, Amazon. There's the most popular one, right? Let's ship to Amazon. First of all, we won't handle Amazon shipments for this reason because it becomes it's a whole thing. Amazon's not going to give out their EIN number. I've seen it happen maybe once, right? So people go, well, how do we ship this stuff in? Well, the answer is you need a warehouse like yourself who's on file with Customs. You need a central point that can then be the ultimate consignee and then distribute to Amazon, okay? Yeah. Is it possible to ship to Amazon? Yes, but Amazon has their own brokers. They have their own planes. It typically is an internal process that's happening there.
Yeah. It's the same situation because we do have a couple of customers who will ship directly to an hospital. And hospitals are very, very reluctant to give their EIN.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess it's the same situation for that. So they need to ship to a warehouse first. That warehouse become the consignee, ultimate consignee,
Yes,
and then
and
after that.
then distribute. And another note to make about that, and we recently just had actually a meeting with Customs about this specific thing, and it all came down to those low value shipments. People, they weren't being enforced as much, and brokers even were putting like fictitious names on these low value shipments because it wasn't necessarily a requirement. So now that they're pushing it, you might still have packages that are $1,000 that get sent through, but here's a caveat. Some of these courier shipments, which you know, many of these companies will not clear in a non-resident importer name. That's a bit scary because if you look at the documents and they see a U.S. resident importer here in the U.S. with an EIN number listed on those documents, many times they will clear that shipment in their name.
It happened to us all the time. And we receive an invoice for the brokerage part. So, yeah.
Yes. So just something to think about. Maybe it's showing up to your door and not in a correct way.
Yeah. Um, Talking about the importer of record, is it right that they're the one who's supposed to pick the tariff code, the HTS code?
Correct. Brokers take different approaches to this. So when I worked at DHL Global Forwarding, they would never pick an HTS code for an importer. They would actually require a piece of paper from the importer that stated what the code was and signed off. Because ultimately in the 90s, what changed is the shift of liability from brokers to importers. So the importer is responsible, the importer of record is responsible for the accuracy of what's being filed, the accuracy of what's on the documentation, and so they are ultimately responsible for the HTS code. Now, I have also been with brokers who, if they see an HTS code listed on an invoice, it's maybe not complete for U.S. Customs, they go with whatever's closest, and they don't have a conversation about it. Maybe it's not accurate because different countries use different terminology. We take the approach, we like to talk to people about it, so we ask, hey, you know, this is the HTS code that's listed. Does that sound accurate? Does it sound anywhere relatively close? The last thing you want to do, let's say you import a medical device and somebody's filing it as plastic parts. You're putting yourself in this huge compliance hole, essentially. Will you be caught? I don't know, but do you want to take that risk, right? You're liable for that, and doing something like that can be considered totally negligent to the U.S. government.
So just to be clear, so a tariff code triggers obviously the tax and duty, right?
Correct.
So the situation that we see a lot, most of the time, is that the tariff code is being chosen by the shipper in China, Germany, whatever.
Okay.
Does those tariff code equal exactly the U.S. tariff code? Are they not international?
So a portion of it is universal. So years ago, decades ago, they made it the tariff universal. So typically, the first 4 to 6 digits of a code listed from an exporter is pretty accurate. The U.S. is the only country in the world to use a 10-digit system. So many times that confuses people too. Well, why are you asking for this code? It's listed. Well, it's partial, but also, are they listing a code, A, that is meant to try to evade a certain duty in the U.S. or a certain regulation, or B, maybe it's accurate for Germany based on their nomenclature and their laws and regulations. But in the U.S., we have different laws, so something is possibly called something else in a different country, and it would be different here. So we always try to have that conversation because, again, we get that mistake from importers a lot too. Well, the shipper said it's this. Okay, well, do you feel that's accurate for your product? Because they're not, Customs is not going to ask the shipper. They're going to ask you.
Yeah. So I guess you can modify that on the spot.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yes,
Okay.
and we tell people, so you're supposed to have an HTS code listed on your documents. That's not always the case, but we try not to, don't push to get a new document just for that. We can change that on the spot, and we have emails that show we had a conversation with the importer
Yeah.
showing, no, that's maybe not accurate, or yeah, that looks accurate to me. I think that that's the best for my product, and that way you have something to show your due diligence in the product.
When you look at the tariff code for the U.S., there's this different chapter, and usually like medical device will be in there under chapter 90, I think, something like that, or 30.
Yes.
Um, does it happen sometimes the customer will ask you, "Oh, can you pick the tariff code?" Will you do it?
It does happen all the time. They say, I don't know anything. Well, sometimes they say, I don't know anything about this product.
Yeah.
Well, you have to. They do say, well, you tell me, do you think it's more like this? And again, I'll have that conversation, but that becomes a very legal line because we are kind of the target of everything. Oh, the broker said this, the broker
Yeah.
said that, the broker.
Yeah.
So the HTS, it's very overwhelming, but if you kind of know how to break it out, it helps. So if you look at the HTS in a public forum, there's all these chapters. The best way to do it is go through those. Don't open the chapters. Just look at the titles of the chapters. If you're bringing in a medical device, you're going to look at that first chapter on live animals and go, obviously my product doesn't fit there. Don't even open it. Don't overwhelm yourself with that. Start narrowing down what chapters your product could be in. Okay, chapter 30 is for pharmaceutical, 34, chapter, maybe it's soap, maybe it's pharmaceuticals, maybe it's a medical device. Narrow down the chapters first before you dive into them.
Okay. So let's say that I'm gonna import medical devices. I want to be set up as the importer of record, and then the custom broker talk about a bond, a power of attorney. What are they referring to exactly?
Yes, so a broker has to have legal authority to act on behalf of an importer. It's no different than being in the medical field. Think of a power of attorney that you would execute to somebody to handle your medical needs should you not be able to, right? It's the same type of concept. So I can't just go talk to the US government about your shipment when I have no right. So every broker in the US has to have a power of attorney to file entry documents on behalf of an importer of record. Now, the actual power of attorneys will look different based on company policy. So those look different. Sometimes we get questions about that. Well, this looks different than this company. Yeah, we all add our own, or we might go off of attorneys. Like we use attorneys to review our POAs because it has everything to do with the regulations on importing. So they need a power of attorney. To import anything over $2,500, there are exceptions, China being one of them, but to import anything over $2,500, an importer needs a customs bond. It's also called a surety bond, annual bond. What a bond is essentially a contract between the importer of record, customs, or the other government agencies, but mostly customs, and the surety company, the bond company. In layman terms, it's kind of like an insurance policy for the government. Should you default on duties and taxes, they have ways that they can come after you for the amount of the bond. It's like an insurance policy. Okay. So it is a contract and it's agreement that is essentially saying the importer is agreeing to the terms of importation, duties, taxes, compliance, all of that.
And I guess you have two choices there. It's a one-time bond or a continuous bond, right?
Correct. So it depends on so we typically have conversations with people about how often do you plan to import in the next 12 months. An annual bond is not a calendar year. It goes into effect when you make it effective, and it's in effect for the 12 preceding months. How often do you think? And I know that's very hard for people starting out. But we have that conversation because, and I'll be honest, a lot of brokers don't care to have that conversation because they make money on bonds. If you don't know what a bond is, hey, I'll write you a single entry bond and make money off of it, right? But we tend to have a conversation. How often do you think you're going to import? Oh, only one time. Okay, great. What is the value? And the reason we ask about that, bonds that are not FDA required, just standard, no other PGAs, are required to cover the amount of what you paid plus duties and taxes. So if it's a $5,000 product, $50 in duty, you need like a $5,500 bond. No biggie. You can do one single entry bond. But medical devices and other imported commodities that require, they say that pose a risk. So anything that requires EPA, FDA, NHTSA have to be written for 3 times the amount of the product you paid for. So in medical devices, you can see how that would add up. Let's say you have a $20,000 product. You need a $60,000 bond. If you only do one bond, you're probably going to pay almost more than you would for the annual bond. So you want to have a conversation and a plan on, okay, do we think we're even going to have 2 shipments in 12 months? 1, what's the cost? Because you want to make sure you're not paying more for bonds than you need to.
So if I import product that costs $5 million, how much is going to be for a bond?
They would never let you write a single entry bond for that.
Okay.
So an annual bond, standard minimal annual bond is a $50,000 bond. That's the least amount you can buy. When you do annual bonds, so conversely to the rules for single bonds, annual bonds have to cover at least 10% of your anticipated duty for those 12 months. So people get really worked up about that because that's a hard thing to think about. First of all, people don't even know how to calculate duty. But you have to also anticipate what you think you're going to import. So you're not often going to run over that $50,000 bond, but the change in China tariffs, as you can imagine, changed that astronomically. So people maybe prior only needed a $50,000 bond, but now you're talking of millions of dollars of duty on top of what you used to pay, and now they need a $200,000 bond. Okay. So the costs depend on the bond company and the broker.
Okay. So a regular $50,000 bond for a continuous bond on the market is about what, $500?
Yeah, we charge $500. I've seen people charge $750. It depends on the broker. We charge $500 for an annual bond for a $50,000 standard.
Let's say that, if I need a bond, can I just call any custom brokerage just for that? Yes. Even if you're not going to take care of my shipment?
Yes. So the answer to that, not every broker sells bonds or has a relationship with a bond company. But to your statement, your bond that you purchase is on file with U.S. Customs, not with a specific broker. So if you just need me to help you get a bond and you don't intend to use me, that's okay. Your bond is on file with Customs, and any broker that you use can utilize that bond to clear your shipments.
So let's say I have a friend who's decided, to start, importing product, and they say, hey, Stephan, can I use your bond?
We get that a lot. They are not transferable.
Okay.
And especially, they're not transferable amongst people, but they are also, and this causes confusion, they're not transferable amongst entities that have a U.S. and foreign company, right? So sometimes they say, well, we're the same company, but you're not. You each have your own EIN or your own, customs number, and they're not transferable. So sometimes people need to think about, if we're going to be the non-resident importer, do we intend to be that way? Because you don't want to buy a bond and then all of a sudden say, well, we're going to switch over to the U.S. company. Now you've just spent money on a bond that can't be transferred.
That's I was actually not aware of that, so that's. So my last question today is usually how long it takes for customs to clear a shipment?
Good question. If we have everything that we need as a broker, and we try to have, a conversation before the shipment arrives, it can be within 2 seconds if the entry's filed. It can be automatic.
Okay.
But people have to understand there is a certain amount of freight that Customs has to examine. Okay. It can be completely random. It can be something that they see internally that a broker would never even know. Maybe this shipper has a flag on their account. They had problems before. We wouldn't be privy to that information. So there can be examinations. Typically, they're at the first port. So if you have freight that's coming to Colorado, for example, we're not going to see a lot of exams in Colorado. It's going to be at that first port of arrival. But if there's not an exam and we have everything we need, it can be instantaneous.
Okay. But if it has to be cleared by FDA also, I, typically I think custom itself, they're pretty quick,
Yeah.
to clear a shipment.
Yes.
But it won't be available until FDA also clear it, right?
Yeah, so there you can recover. So as when you ship freight, there are last free days at airports, ports. You start charging storage after a certain amount of time because they have to keep freight moving, right? You can pick up customs cleared freight that is not FDA cleared. However, it is supposed to stay within the same port. That gets a little difficult with courier shipments because they move them out so fast.
Yeah.
You can deliver them. They must be held intact. They cannot be open, distributed, touched. You can literally take it off the pallet or take it off of the truck and leave it quarantined. Because if you move it and they want to examine it, you are responsible for getting it back.
Okay. So it's a choice that FedEx, for example, will take to deliver the shipment to us. We're next to the airport here. If they have to take it back, they will for free take it back to the airport.
They'll
Oh.
charge you. Now, I will say this: physical exams from FDA. We had one the other day, but I don't see that many. I probably in my entire 14 years, physical FDA exams, I've probably seen 10.
Yeah.
Review of documents and notice of actions and conversations about what needs to change, a lot. Okay, that's more likely than an actual physical exam. Doesn't mean it can't happen.
Yeah.
But it's much less likely than an actual document review where they're going to look at what you've put in the system. Does it match? Is it accurate? So I have a document and I have what I put in the system. Those match, but does that match what you have on file with FDA?
Yeah.
Maybe that's wrong. So they're looking for consistencies and accurate information more often than anything. Every once in a while they'll ask for copies of labels, pictures of the labels, because they want to ensure that it's labeled correctly. But more often on the entry side, they're making sure that that data and those medical device listings and the manufacturers are all accurate.
Okay. And so I guess when you receive a notice of action, it's a serious action, I guess.
Yes, I mean, we did have one, we had one last week where we got a notice of action. They said, you didn't put any of the radiation emitting numbers in there. Yes, we did. There's 20 lines. They never admit they're wrong, but they ended up taking back the notice of action. But yes, when you get a notice of action, typically it's something that they want you to address or something is incorrect.
Okay. And how long usually the FDA will take, if they have to review, when they have to review, is it, do they have a timeline, 24 hour, 84 hour, how long it takes?
Every port is different.
Okay.
We have, so typically entries will always automatically go FDA review. People get a little nervous about this FDA review, but that is an automatic response on every entry, okay? We take the stance of uploading documents to FDA immediately. A lot of brokers do not. They wait till there's a hold or until they ask. So we upload the docs. They might look at it. If the information's accurate and consistent, I would expect 24 hours.
Okay.
Okay? I would expect some are same day if it's something, a lot of times if there's something that's a little bit less risky or it's covered by another, we have shipments that are agriculture and FDA. And if it's primarily agriculture, we very rarely see FDA step in.
Okay.
But on medical devices, I would say 24 hours if all the information's accurate. They are the government. Sometimes they make mistakes or sometimes, something is, they're not seeing something that we're seeing. But I would say typically 24 hours if you have somebody that's staying on top of it. Now, every once in a while, we have ports. They do not let you contact them for 48 hours. That's most ports.
Yeah.
Denver, we have a pretty good relationship. Usually after 24 hours, we can reach out to them. They're getting closer to being 48. Most ports are 48. If you start talking about LA, even Cincinnati, when you're dealing with like courier shipments because of the volume, New York, a lot of them will not let you even reach out for 4 business days
Wow.
for the
Okay.
review. And that's just to ask, have you reviewed this? Do you need
Yeah.
anything else, right? Most of the time, I would say within 2 days, 3 days. If it gets beyond 2 to 3 days, I always assume there's probably a notice of action coming.
Yeah. And they send a physical letter, that's what we
Yes.
receive usually. That's kind of
Yes.
interesting.
And it's a little intimidating, I know,
Yeah.
especially for new importers, to get that. Just know when you get a notice of action, it is just that. They expect you to act. Don't sit on it.
Yeah.
You have only a certain amount of time. Very rarely, well, I've never seen it where it's just flat out denied. They're
Yeah.
going to say, hey, your labeling says this, fix it. Or you're saying it's this product, it's not that, fix it. Usually you can remedy the problem unless you're, again, just negligently shipping something that's never been registered.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that was a very interesting conversation. We went over our time that we planned, but I think, and I guess people will have questions when they're going to see this. So maybe we're going to do another part someday. But I want to thank you very much. That was super interesting, and I'm sure people will learn a lot. That was the intention. Last word for you.
No, you guys are welcome. I mean, if you have questions that are, hey, a quick question, you're welcome to give me a call. You can give out my information, Stephan.
Perfect.
And if you need to set up a call, we offer that too. If you want to sit down and have a more in-depth conversation about any of this that we've discussed.
Yeah.
So,
And I want to advise people to just tell them, and we do that at the same time. So, people would call and ask question. If it's a quick question, we can answer. But if it's more deep, conversation, I think people should expect that there's going to be some fee attached to that. But that's become a consulting fee. So don't expect that everything is free, but that it becomes very, very important because anytime a product is stuck at custom, it's expensive for the company.
yes.
And there's fiscal and legal obligation attached to that, so they could be a good thing to plan in advance, set up a call, make sure that you all set up. Yeah, totally. Well, thank you again. It was a pleasure, and talk to you soon. Take care. Bye bye. Bye.